ensuring an appropriate separation of powers between the executive and others. Then there is a difficult problem of people wanting to make money easily. And that history has a very interesting root. That history has a root in apartheid. That history has a root which shows us that most of the members of parliament who got into a new parliament in 1994 were actually very, very poor people. They had absolutely nothing, which is not the case in many other countries where parliamentarians normally have a house or something of that sort. So they were very poor, and capital moved into the bargain quite quickly. Capital was very quick in beginning to understand that there is a weakness here. So we all know that this kind of corruption that we are talking about do not represent the actions of government alone. They represent the conduct of capital and the government. Civil society on the one hand and government on the other. You must have two parties to a corrupt deal, not only one. And therefore the private sector cannot disclaim responsibility. In most of these cases, the private sector is as responsible as the public sector. And therefore the work that is necessary is not aimed at reforming the private sector, the public sector alone. I think that the private sector must take full responsibility. It is the duty of organizations of this kind to make sure that the private sector takes full responsibility. Otherwise, we're not going to get anywhere with that either. At the moment, the private sector, particularly capital in this country and business in this country, take the view that what they have done is all absolutely and utterly correct, and that the fault lines are only in government. The trouble is that there are fault lines in civil society, there are fault lines in political parties, of course, there are fault lines within capital, there are fault lines where there is greed in capital and greed in government. And somehow we have to ensure that we have a program where people understand that capital too is a serious guilty party in all of this, and that if we think that problem can be solved by simply reforming government, it is not going to work at all. There must be a new way in which we in the private sector begin to look at the way in which we conduct our lives, because there is an interaction between the way in which the private sector conduct their lives on the one hand and what happens in the public sector. Corruption can only happen if two people clap hands. And therefore, the change that we need to bring about is not limited to the public sector alone. It is also limited it also embraces the private sector. And then, of course, in the public and private sector, there is the need for constitutional education. You would have noticed that while there was a lot of talk about the Constitution and ensuring that the constitutional injunctions be fulfilled, when we started our government, our democracy in 1994, as time has gone on, the reference to the Constitution has become less and less and less. And I wonder, how many parliamentarians understand our Bill of Rights? How many parliamentarians understand precisely what their duties are in terms of the Constitution? How many parliamentarians understand their responsibilities of accountability and openness? By the way, when I retired as a judge, I made an offer to Parliament that I'm quite happy to conduct classes on their understanding of the Constitution free of charge. My letter did not even receive an answer, despite the fact that it was followed up by a few more letters later. So again, parliamentarians, the Constitution has got to come to the forefront. The values of our Constitution of dignity, human dignity, equality and freedom, the improvement of the quality of lives of all our people. So there must be an understanding of these constitutional obligations amongst all political parties and upon everyone who governs us at every level. Otherwise, we're not going to get anywhere. And part of this also is that hopefully we'll get to the situation where our children will start learning about our constitutional values, that we will have introduced in schools our constitutional obligations, that when they grow up and they get into business, whether they get into business or whether they get into